Good afternoon. We'll be calling the Special Ordinance Committee meeting to order. May we have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Gutierrez.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse.
Here.
Madam Chair Snedden.
Here. And do we have speaker slips for any items not on the agenda?
We do not.
Okay, thank you. So with that, we'd like to invite the staff report and update on our ordinance.
Thank you very much. I'm Renee Irely, Environmental Services Division Manager, and we are here today to talk about the revisions to the plastic straw stirrers and cutlery ordinance. Today I'll be going very briefly on the background over what's occurred over the last several months, provide some update around ordinance adoption and consideration that's happening across the state, and then go into some more detail about the updated language around the regulated activities, exemptions, and the enforcement included in the draft ordinance. So we originally came to Sustainability Committee last year talking about expanded polystyrene. Over the course of several conversations, then with the Ordinance Committee, we looked into the addition of plastic straws and cutlery, and the ability to regulate them either by on-demand or bans. When we brought the ordinance to the council on July 24th, we were asked to refer back to the Ordinance Committee to consider the addition of stirrers as part of the ban. And that allowed us to do some additional outreach between then and now in September, particularly with the community around the medical accommodations that we had included in the ordinance as well. So obviously, generally straw campaigns like single-use bags before it are about pointing out the prevalence of single-use plastics in our lives. And it's a way to encourage behavior and also manufacturing changes. To that end, communities around California are rapidly adopting straw ordinances. We, by our count, have 15 that have either been adopted or contemplated in the state so far, not including the one here in Santa Barbara. In addition, at the state level, AB 1884, which would create on-demand, by request only, for plastic straws at full-service restaurants, has passed the legislature, and it is awaiting the governor's signature. And it does, also I wanted to mention, does explicitly exclude takeout restaurants, and it is a good first start in terms of on-demand language. So here in front of you is the list of all the approved ordinances so far around the state, as you'll see on the left. And these are jurisdictions that either have already enacted a plastic straw ordinance and or are poised to do so by the beginning of January 2019. And as you'll see, 7 out of the 9 did ban the plastic straws. 2, in particular, Davis and San Luis Obispo, have adopted upon request ordinances. In addition, there is another 6 that are pending and under consideration around the state, including the city of Los Angeles. So I'll spend the remainder of the presentation on the key adjustments that we've made in the ordinance since July. The first was to add stirrers to the ban language in addition to the plastic straws. And as you'll see there, it would make it unlawful for any food provider or beverage provider to use plastic beverage straws or stirrers, or to provide, distribute, or sell these straws or stirrers to any person. In addition, we changed the enactment date from January 1st to July 1st, 2019 to allow more of transition time should this be adopted. The second piece is the plastic cutlery distribution. That remains by request at all restaurants in the city. And around exemptions, particularly for hardship, this is pages 6 through 8 in the ordinance itself, if you're following along. We simplified some of the language based on council feedback. In particular, it would be a one-time only exemption for businesses via the application process, and the finance director would have the discretion to approve the application in whole or in part. The other element of particular interest around the exemptions is around public safety and the medical or / special needs access. So the one section, 16502B2 for public health and safety, does remain the same, and that allows under the application process for a specific entity to apply for an exemption if needed. But the second section under 050, which is D3, actually provides a blanket exemption for any restaurant or a beverage provider to distribute plastic straws to any person in order to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. We simplified this language pretty significantly, and Mr. Cologne might want to weigh in right here to talk about this.
Thanks, Ms. Madam Chair, members of the committee, the handout at your places has changes on this subject. I wanted to call that to your attention. At the bottom of page 8 of the handout, you'll see that the differences between what was in your packet and what is published online and this document are shown by double underscoring or double strikeouts. That's how you can see the difference from where you were yesterday before you got this and today. And some double strikeouts to look at are at the bottom of page 8 of the handout. Correct. There was some fairly, I thought, complicated language around the Americans with Disabilities Act that made it look like the city or the provider was going to have to be making accommodation decisions. We don't want to put people through that. So the proposal at the bottom of 8 simply says that there is an exemption whenever a food or beverage provider provides straws in order to assure full compliance with the ADA. And the thinking there is that if they're going to err, let them err in favor of providing somebody a plastic straw rather than interfering with their rights under the ADA. Thanks, Ms. Irely.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Cologne. So while we had already had this exemption in the previous version of the ordinance, we did make these modifications, partly in discussions with the independent living and medical community, just to make sure that the language was inclusive and not cumbersome as possible. In addition, we also removed the language around the selling of plastic straws to make it clear that there shouldn't be compensation to be able to make this accommodation. And then finally, enforcement. So we had a lot of discussions around the explicit language for this ordinance in particular. And while the previous draft referenced standard code elements here in the city, and certainly any first and early violators were not targeted or in the intention of the previous ordinance, we did make the language more explicit, and we'll go through that right here in a minute. I'd also like to point out that it's extremely rare for the trash and recycling violations to escalate to fines, much less anything else more stringent. We rely very heavily on the voluntary compliance component as written in the code and really our robust education program to ensure that the businesses and residents in the city are complying with the regulations that we have in place. And we've had great success with that work over the years. I think the single bag ban is a great example of that. We got that into place and enforced without a single violation. In addition, last year, just so point of reference around what enforcement looks like for our division, in 2017, we had 17 warnings and 5 fines actually administered. These were all for illegal dumping or repeated trash violations. So as you can see around more of the environmental programmatic elements, it has been very successful based on the voluntary and educational elements. Oh. That being said, proposed in the new draft, there's more explicit language that would show like what that escalation would look like, would it be necessary. Again, it would start with education with our outreach team. The next step would be for a warning notice to be issued in the event that we could not get compliance, to make sure that there is an understanding of what the ordinance element actually entails and its intention. The second and third violations would be could be administrative fines, and both our program mirrors the fine escalation that is seen throughout the rest of the city, and that's a $100 fine to a $200 fine to a $250 should that be necessary. The fourth and fifth and following violations could be like infractions and or misdemeanors. And again, I'll refer back to Mr. Colon to discuss that.
Thank you, Ms. Arley. I think it's appropriate that I step up and take some responsibility for how this is structured. And I'd like the committee to think of it this way. Last time, the law just said, go do what you normally do, which is use your ordinary enforcement discretion. And in the course of that ordinary enforcement discretion, we don't try and put people in jail for plastic straws. It would be a surprise that an administrative citation would even issue. But me saying that doesn't mean it won't happen. So what this ordinance does now is put in some safeguards that control how your enforcement officials, including me, can function. And so that means that the first thing that has to happen is a written warning. And the point of the warning is to say, we assume you weren't aware of this law. Here's the law. Here's what could happen if you continue to violate. Now, the second and third violations can't turn into anything criminal. So no infraction, no misdemeanor. The second and third violations would be, as Ms. Irely said, our standard civil penalty, which would be the 100, 200, 250 progression that Ms. Irely identified. Where I get into it is that in looking at the situation, we have to span this really broad gap between the most innocent, disabled, friendly person from out of town to a corporation that really couldn't care less about what Santa Barbara says and dumps scooters all over town. So we deal with that kind of spectrum in our enforcement. I owe it to you, as I owe it to the people, to leave room to enforce against that big giant that we hope doesn't come, but that could. So what happens now with this ordinance is that for violations fourth and following within a year, we can, in addition, use our criminal enforcement tools, which are pretty small anyway. An infraction penalty under the code is 100, 200, 250, and a misdemeanor is $1,000, if I remember right, or 6 months in jail. So imagine the ordinance set up to accommodate the innocent violation by giving a reasonable warning, but still allow enforcement against an egregious, in-your-face kind of corporate salute that we have been getting. I'll editorialize there for a second because I think people need to understand it. I've watched with great interest and kind of quiet seen the irony in Uber's new ad campaign that following the law is actually kind of a good way to do business. So that's what we're up against.
May I ask a question? Infractions or misdemeanors? Misdemeanors go on an individual's record. Is that correct? And do infractions go on the criminal record of an individual?
Yeah, they're all criminal citations. A misdemeanor can get you jailed. That's the thing that's different. I don't know how long a misdemeanor stays on your record versus an infraction.
And the 1 through 3 violations that couldn't turn into anything criminal, those would not be on a criminal record anywhere?
No.
Okay.
No. The existence of those, however, would have to be proved by the officer that wrote ticket number 4.
Okay.
The city would bear the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that 1 through 3 happened.
Thank you. I'll reserve discussion on that until we're finished. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, actually, we are finished with the formal presentation. Good timing. And we would to turn it back to the committee for discussion. We do recommend that it gets referred to the City Council to adopt the ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll do questions from the committee first and then public comment. Do we have any questions before public comment?
I have one.
Mr. Gutierrez.
Under the report on page 3 under environmental review, there's something I just kind of need a little clarification. It says the city environmental analysis has reviewed the proposed ordinance and determined it to be categorically exempt from the requirements of CEQA. What are those requirements exactly?
I'm just wanting to pull up that part of the agenda report so that I can make sure I quote it accurately. Okay. The California Environmental Quality Act goes back to the early 70s, and it was designed to require state agencies and cities to give a hard look at the environmental consequences of things they were doing, of their decisions. The courts interpreted it very broadly to apply to private development projects as well. So since the later part of the 70s, the state's environmental law has really significantly governed all development in California. And it's, on the one hand, it is reviled and called the victim of affordable housing and development. On the other hand, it's the protector of the environment. What that law says is that when some city action may have a significant effect on the environment, the city must do an environmental impact report unless there's an exemption or something else. What the staff report is saying is that the whole point of this ordinance is to reduce the amount of plastic. Therefore, there's no reason to do an environmental study about the environmental consequences of it. That's been a pretty quiet issue with straws. To take you back a few years, it was not a quiet issue in the battle between the paper bag makers and the plastic bag makers. They both tried to say the other was better environmentally.
Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Colon, you did try to address the ADA issues in the verbal sense. 9.165.030, sale and distribution of plastic straws and stirrers. It shall be unlawful for any food provider or beverage provider to use plastic straws or stirrers or provide the following to any person, and doesn't exclude in that sentence what's going on. And you get down to the public health and safety. And apparently, if I'm reading this correctly, and I may not be, this is where the finance director can grant that exemption. But and there's a lot of strikeouts in there, but it says, demonstrate a public health and safety requirement or medical necessity. And I'm wondering what the standard is. I mean, you know, I'm a caregiver. I'm an elder caregiver, or I'm working in some kind of recovery clinic where a plastic straw has a medical purpose. And yet, am I required, or is my institution required to provide documented permission to use this instrument that is otherwise prohibited by 9.165030?
Oh, thank you. Madam Chair, Committee Member Rouse, what we tried to do with this revision of the ordinance was to imitate what worked quite successfully with the cannabis rules and that I've been talking about time to time, and that is we tried to take a lot of the specifics of the regulations out of the ordinance and put them into regulations that the finance director would create. Our assumption is that those regulations are going to be darn simple, and I'd rather that the finance director had the opportunity to do a half-page application form that says, yeah, that's health and safety, than elaborate 10 pages of code on what that means. So my thought was, let's trust that the finance director who you approve when they're hired and whose boss you can fire is going to do the right thing with regulations rather than trying to define the whole world of what we might run up against. So my point is this: when you're in a confusing, complicated area where you're not sure what the rules ought to be, it's sometimes good to delegate that out to somebody closer to the businesses. And if they understand your intent is to be supportive, they're going to be supportive.
Okay, I get that, and that makes sense. I just wondered, for example, I run Val Verde, and I have to use these straws as part of my daily care regimen for my patients. Should I then have on file with the finance director some kind of documentation along those lines per this ordinance? And if so, do those need to be renewed on a periodic basis?
Mayor Pro Tem, if I might also interject, that the ordinance is geared for the retail interaction and whether that straw is distributed. The medical use at a hospital or for an independent living facility, I think, would be basically categorically exempted from that. Any additional process as well.
Okay,
the way
I just
this is
didn't
written.
read it that way, but
So,
yeah.
But yes, but I think it gets covered under D3, includes that broader exemption as well.
I'm sorry,
And that's correct, and the finance director would not be involved.
I'm sorry. Would you repeat that? I'm sorry. I didn't understand what you said.
Excuse me. So under that same exemptions section, under D3, where so there's two places, but the D3 with the food or beverage provider, I guess my point is that, I'm sorry, that's page 8. It's about mid.
D3? Okay,
D3.
thank you.
This is where we are explicit that and I guess overall that the intent of the ordinance is for retail exchange, and whether that plastic straw is given or not. Between the public safety section and then also this section, the healthcare provider or hospital is not even considered as part of the ordinance overall.
If I might, the definition of food provider and beverage provider, each of those require service to the public. So,
in other words, a casual caregiver, somebody you would hire casually in your home to take care of the elderly aunt that would use those things would not be, I mean, they may not necessarily qualify under ADA, but they would be excluded from this as part of the...
Correct, unless
they could source
Cousin Willie's the
materials in the first place, right?
Yeah.
All right, it was nitpicky, but once again, this is a crazy, complicated bunch of words of what we're trying to do here. So, but I'll talk about that later.
I have one more question before we hear public comment and move to discussion. So in the case of a food service worker providing straws, who gets the citation? Is it the business? Is it the food service worker individually carrying out the requests of the business? Who is actually accountable there?
Our definitions are pretty clearly the entity or owner rather than, not the service person.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions before we move to public comment? Okay, I'd like to first invite Penny Owens to speak.
Good afternoon, Ordinance Committee, Chair, Council members, Penny Owens with Santa Barbara Channel Keeper. First off, we would just really like to thank all of you for revisiting and your further discussions and all the work that you, as well as city staff and council, have put into these efforts to reduce single-use plastic. Please know that it's greatly appreciated. We strongly support the staff recommendations for this ordinance, restricting the use of plastic cutlery, plastic beverage straws, and plastic stirrers, along with the addition of the ban on plastic stirrers and any clarification that's been updated on the municipal code regarding enforcement. As we've mentioned in the past, Channel Keeper is out in the community talking with folks and spreading the word about the impacts of plastic pollution, and we're happy to continue our education and outreach efforts ahead of these ordinances becoming effective. As you've also heard about, our Skip the Straw campaign has been, really well received by the community and local businesses, and in fact, we're taking it to other areas as well. And we really feel like the community of Santa Barbara is ready to take this important step to reduce our use of single-use plastic. And I just want to highlight, coming up this weekend is another Coastal Cleanup Day event. So from 9 to noon, you can head to any beach in the area and help pick up pollution on our beaches. And we've shared the statistics of what the number of plastic straws we find on our beaches here in Santa Barbara. And it's around 500 straws from a single day event throughout the county. And we just really look forward to that number next year being significantly lower, and finding fewer and fewer straws and stirrers. So we urge you to support this ordinance before you today. And again, we thank you for your efforts on this. And we look forward to this being before the council, the full council, for consideration as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Next will be Kathy King.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I'm Kathy King, Director of Outreach and Education at the Community Environmental Council, and I thank you for your continuing leadership on single-use plastic reduction. We're really grateful for the recently passed legislation to limit expanded polystyrene, and we appreciate all your time and effort in addition to city staff, and we're really proud of our decade-long partnership with Santa Barbara Channel Keeper. Of all the plastics reduction that I've worked on for the past decade, the straws so far seem to be the easiest one for people to get their heads around. I've seen that aha moment of course I don't need a straw so many times. We've been advocating for straw reduction most of this year and have done a lot of outreach and have worked with local businesses who jumped on the campaign and immediately saw significant economic benefits. Businesses, we've talked about further reduction that includes stirrers and cutlery and other items in an on-request provision will also allow them to save money and protect the environment. In terms of the items for discussion today, we fully support the staff recommendation, and we continue to recognize the need for the exceptions to allow for straws with those for special needs. We also recognize the need to adjust or amend the municipal code language. And since I don't think the intent was originally to include retail sales, we also agree that that language can be tightened up to resolve that. We are in full support of the addition of stirrers to the ban, which will make us unique in that. And straw reduction laws, as you saw in the report, do have a lot of momentum. Several have passed since our first discussion about this back in June. There's more than a dozen cities, including large places like San Francisco. I was recently in Malibu, and Starbucks there still has their traditional green straw, only they're made out of paper. Culver City staff told us that fast food outlets there are using pasta instead of straws for thicker items like milkshakes. And as we heard, there is a law on Governor Brown's desk that is awaiting signature that would require all dine-in restaurants to provide straws only on request. We're in favor of this, but we don't think it goes far enough. However, it doesn't preempt municipalities like ours from going further. We would like to see this before full council as soon as possible, again, because as Penny mentioned, we are working with neighboring jurisdictions, and Santa Barbara's leadership is significant on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And our next speaker will be Danny Anderson.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Danny Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of the Independent. Can you hear me? Thank you. My name is Danny Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of the Independent Living Resource Center. Just want to take a moment to thank you. We were reached out to get the opinion and ideas of the disability community. We also support this with the exemptions that have been discussed today. We just really think that it's important to educate the community on the fact that straws for many of us with disabilities who can't lift a cup to our lips to take a sip are a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. You wouldn't ask someone to take a ramp to a restaurant that has a stair to get into it, so why would you ask them to bring their own straws? So we support this fully. We appreciate the exemption. We also see the intersectionality piece between the environmental organizations and the disability organizations, and we see that there's going to be a huge environmental impact on this, even with the people with disabilities having the exemption, because it's such a small percentage who actually require the use of straws. My only question for the committee would be, once this gets rolling, as we hope it does, if restaurants refuse to provide straws to a person with a disability who requests one, what kind of enforcement will be happening with that? Because it feels like we're going to have another opportunity where people with disabilities are just going to have to advocate for what they need. And we get a little tired of having to do that all the time. So if we could get a little more clarification on that side of the enforcement, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kalan, do we have any?
Well, we don't currently, the city currently doesn't require the provision of straws for people who might need accommodation at a private facility. We don't have any city policy that, separate title of the ADA, that needs reasonable modification around straws. So right now that's not an issue the city gets involved with. And I think any business at their peril of a private lawsuit under the ADA could now refuse to provide a straw.
Thank you. It is now to the committee for discussion. Mayor Pro Tem Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, listening to both Ms. Owens and Ms. King, and also before with the Heal the Ocean, made the point precisely. Their public education and outreach, prior to us taking this on as an ordinance, created an overwhelmingly successful, and staff as well, by the way, Ms. Hartley, overwhelmingly successful response. 100% as far as I know, maybe not 100%, but at every place I've gone, certainly stopped using straws as an automatic default. They were doing on request only. Many have switched to paper products, and this is in the full-service restaurant area. Other places, such as places that have takeout, like the hamburger habits and whatnot, have a lot of inventory to amortize, which this provides for, not being in effect for a while. But a lot of people also bought things that are going to be prohibited by this, like things that were compostable and biodegradable, or what they thought were at the time. I guess now that this is also going to be rejected in this particular ordinance. What's striking to me is, and everybody knows how I feel about this, is that we have this compliance, we have community participation, we have enthusiasm for doing this, and yet we decided we need to legislate it. And even these questions of ADA wouldn't be a question that we'd have to address or even contemplate or talk about if this were on demand only, as was requested in the first place by our environmental groups. We're the ones that brought this in as a straw ban. And where the concern is that we struck out of this language the section on what a ware was, a restaurant ware, for a good purpose, because it made it unnecessarily complicated. Well, this whole thing's unnecessarily complicated because as we look at things that are going to be single use, for example, for a takeout place, you do have straws, you have cutlery. You also have what they call souffle cups, or little plastic ramekins full of sauces. You have ketchup packets. There's a billion things we can go through that we're eventually going to have to get to. But we're going for the low-hanging fruit here simply to symbolically have done it. Where we had before, anything happened, or currently what's going on, even without the threat of legal issues, we have total compliance. So I'm actually kind of upset with our council for even spending the amount of staff and legal time we have on it up till now. For something we're going to have to revisit for Ziploc bags. We're going to have to revisit it for plastic bottle tops. There's going to be a lot of single-use plastic out there that hasn't been addressed by this. I was recently, 2 weeks ago, I was in a beach cleanup with a youth group, and there were about 35 of us, and we did all of Ledbetter Beach. And we came back and we compared our loads, and every one of us found cigarette butts. Although we have a law against smoking, every one of us found cigarette butts. We didn't find any straws, fair amount of dog poop, and a couple of bags that went along with that, which is unfortunate. My point is that it isn't that plastic isn't bad and the straws aren't bad in a marine environment. They're horrible in a marine environment. But I think community participation and the things we've done so far as a community are so much more effective, so much less complicated. Because this, even though this is an ordinance that we may or may not bring to council today, forward to council, it's still unnecessarily complicated. We've already spent way too much time and resources on this. We have a lot of other fish to fry besides this. As fish might be a bad word in this case. So I am not going to support sending this forward. In fact, I'm going to make a motion that we not forward this and that we go back to basically the kind of language that's been forwarded now in AB 1884 statewide about doing these on demand. So I'm going to move that we make that an alternative to what's been presented here today. I'll make that motion, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, let us have a discussion further to that. So you are seconding not forwarding this to the council in its current form. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. I had a few other things I was going to bring up in revisions that I would like to see. I think we were all in agreement, those of us who supported this, that we did not want this to be criminalized to the level. Certainly we heard a lot about it in the media. It was not necessarily represented the way we had intended. I would like to see it just not be possible to have a misdemeanor for a straw violation. I'd even like to take it down away from infraction. I think continued fines and education could get us to the same place. I recognize I'm speaking to a different ordinance than what the motion and the second would be forwarding. I did want to voice that. There's absolutely no intention of criminalizing straws. I would like to ask the difference in recyclability of straws versus some of these other items that you're discussing that might also have to be regulated, the cups or whatever. And what my understanding is that straws are not truly recyclable, so they fall in a different category. And if you could clarify that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, that's true. Plastic straws, generally, like in terms of both the material that they are constructed of, and then also the ability to capture them, make them trash. There is no recyclable ability to handle them, either from infrastructure or from material. And despite the challenges with the ongoing national and international processing of plastics, other particularly like rigid plastics like cups and lids and things are still classified as recyclable, and there is still some of that handling right now. It's much more challenging, of course, right now, given the collapse of the markets in Asia in particular. But the way they are constructed, there is a life cycle of recyclability to them.
So straws are in a different category of recyclability, and there are other alternatives for plastic straws. Is that correct?
Yes, in terms of compostable materials, whether that's made from some sort of sugar base or like the pasta you mentioned, or the paper, the straws, which are almost feel like cardboard. Some of them now they're quite rigid themselves, or reusables. Should you again need a straw as opposed to foregoing a straw at all, there is the metal and bamboo, et cetera, which are reusable.
And then another clarifying question. For the compliance, when there was outreach and education for the compliance, Mayor Pro Tem also that with, I believe that was with styrofoam, that we had nearly 100% compliance. I'm not sure that we have asked of our industry to.
I was speaking anecdotally. I don't actually know if it's 100%, but it's my
Or close to. And I would agree with that with the expanded polystyrene, that there was a lot of voluntary compliance, but I'm not sure that we've gone through that phase with plastic straws or done any kind of inventory of.
Madam Chair, you are correct. With the straws, we have less information. It is more anecdotal, partly because we were starting to work on that outreach later in the process. But I would say among the contacts that we have had, and in addition to the information that we've received from Channel Keeper and from the CEC, that the early adopters are quite, are eager to go ahead and move forward in that way. So.
Thank you. I think we've already seen a change in that. I will ask Mr. Kalan, am I able to make another motion to be considered before this one has come to vote, or do we need to vote on this particular motion, seconded motion, first?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, there are at least two motions in order. One would be a motion to amend the Councilmember Rouse's motion. The other would be a substitute motion. A substitute motion would must have the effect, in order to be a substitute, of rejecting in its entirety the first motion and moving another direction. So if the substitute motion were to move to forward the ordinance to the City Council with conditions X, Y, and Z, it would take precedence and be voted on first. And if that vote were successful, you'd vote on it as the main motion.
Okay. I will be making a substitute motion, but I see that Councilmember Gutierrez's light is on. Did you want to speak to this motion first or hear the substitute motion?
I just need some clarification on something.
Please go ahead.
With the ADA, does a person, if they claim that they want a straw because they have a disability, do they have to prove it? Or can they just say, I'm disabled, can I get a straw?
There's nothing in the ordinance that would require an individual to prove their disability. In terms of day-to-day life, the ADA has depended for enforcement on private lawsuits. So they're a private individual who's denied their rights under the ADA can bring a lawsuit and get their attorney's fees for enforcing that right. So that's how those decisions get made ultimately.
Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse has a comment to this motion.
Yeah, thank you, to the motion to it. And I think the more comments that get made, the more the point, and as we ask about laws, we ask about criminality, we ask about penalties, all of that goes away if we simply go to the on-demand situation. None of the complications exist. The performance is already there. And once again, I'll remind us that because of a smoking ordinance, you can't smoke in the city of Santa Barbara, but what do you find on the beaches? And everybody does a beach cleanup, we'll find cigarette butts. So the law itself didn't cure. But the educational outreach by these organizations and staff has done yeoman's work. And I do believe that we will continue to do so. So my very purpose is to save further staff time, save further complication, save a lot of public ridicule, frankly, as well, and do something that actually works and continue with what's actually working, and let's move on to other issues. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse, may I ask you a question? Would the on-demand have any requirement that the straw provided not be plastic?
I didn't have a specific meaning. I was thinking about 1884, AB 1884, as proposed statewide, which I think will likely get signed by the governor. Don't know. There is one thing, though. Somebody like me in my business would necessarily have plastic straws in case I had a customer who needed one, or somebody who was elderly, or even a small child. But in terms of providing them on without request, no. I mean, and mine are all gone now. I'm all paper. But I do think that the public education has done exactly that. And frankly, as Mr. Tracewell from Blenders would tell you, public opinion of your product and your business is really compelling. Back in the non-smoking ordinance days, our business was way ahead of what the council came up with back in the 80s, I think it was, about smoking, because we do respond to public, and we do respond to organizations that go out and do outreach. So I think our work is done here, ma'am.
I would like to make a substitute motion that we forward the current draft before us, taking into account that it was referred back to us by a full council to not only include what was in the previous draft, but to double down on plastic stirrers as well. I feel we would be doing the will of the council to bring this back as directed by the full council. I would also like to reiterate the added responsibility that we have as an affluent coastal community that has a high level of tourism, that when we do education and outreach to our residents, we are not reaching everyone who comes and visits the city. We have an opportunity here. In my substitute motion, I would like to move this forward to the full council with an amendment that we have no provision for misdemeanors or infractions, frankly. I would really like to see the criminalization of this be eliminated, but have incentives through fines to further this ordinance. Is there a second on the substitute motion?
I'll second that.
Thank you. So we have two seconded motions on the table. Are we ready for a vote, or do we have further discussion? Okay,
so now with the substitute motion received a second, it's on the full, it's ready to vote.
It's ready to vote. Is there further discussion on the substitute motion before we take a vote? Okay, may we have a roll call vote?
Councilmember Gutierrez.
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse.
No.
Madam Chair Snedden.
Yes. That concludes the first motion, or the substitute motion, and I believe...
The substitute motion is a rejection of the main motion.
Okay.
There you go.
So this will now go to full council with the amendment for approval, or does it come back to ordinance again?
That's up to you. My advice would be to send it on to the council, because the way I understood the decriminalization, it will be pretty easy for us to draft.
Okay. Maybe we should have a motion. I'll make a motion that we send the amended ordinance on to the full council rather than back to Ordinance Committee. Is there a second?
A second.
And let's take a roll call vote.
Councilmember Gutierrez.
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse.
No.
Madam Chair Seddon.
Yes. The motion carries, and I believe with that, we may adjourn the meeting. Thank you.